Jesus is God. Jesus is Lord. Jesus has the victory.
We all have a call to greatness, a desire for it. We want to do something good.
Now is your time. You could change the world, and the world needs changing, so get busy.
Shalom World, God's own channel.
Glory to Jesus Christ. Welcome back to school, and also welcome back to our classroom. I'm Father Thomas Loya. In order to understand the next hot button issue we're going to address here through our sacramental glasses, that sacramental liturgical worldview, we're going to have to understand a little bit of history. For a long time, mankind basically looked at the powers of nature, the natural law, the way creation was, and it had a sense that it was quite a bit more powerful than we were. Some cultures even worshipped nature, and they created gods out of aspects of nature and so on. But there was, throughout history, a sense of this incredible creation being greater than we are. And we are the high point of creation, of course, but still, the wisdom that God has put into the creation of the universe, of the whole cosmos, is greater than we are. We can't possibly fully understand, although we continue to learn. But what happened was, around about the 16th century, there was a shift, a very significant shift in that perspective. This is when we began to develop science as we know it today. And for the first time, through scientific things, microscopes and experiments and so on, human beings began to realize that they could actually do things to nature. They could actually, in a sense, kind of control nature. And this was good. Science is good, of course. However, a worldview, and you notice how we're always talking about a worldview. We talk about contraceptive worldview, the sacramental liturgical worldview, because everything starts from a fundamental perspective. Well, a worldview began to develop from this budding scientific advancements. The worldview we're going to call the scientific rationalist worldview. Because for the first time, since human beings could do things in nature they couldn't do before, in a sense kind of dominate, that discover things, heal things, cure things, manipulate things, we began to develop a sense that the physical order maybe was not that great anymore, that we could have a certain almost sort of dominance over it. We can start to get our hands in there and control and manipulate it. So what began to happen in our worldview then is that the whole physical world, the world of matter, began to, in a sense, decrease in quality in our perspective. And the things that were beyond matter, like intelligence, things of the spirit, spiritual things, began to then take on a greater significance. So what happened was we began to develop a rather dichotomous worldview. But this was not unique just to this era. We're talking about the 16th century. We had other, what we call heresies in the past, in the history of the church, like the Manichaean heresy, for instance, where these heresies debased the physical and sort of raised the spiritual to an inordinate place beyond the physical. So the physical was sort of like spirit good, or intellectual and visible things good, physical things like the body and so on bad, or not so good. And this was a very fragmented, disintegrated worldview. Well, we come to the 16th century, and this worldview takes on kind of an accelerated state with the advent of science. And again, science is good, but the worldview that came out at that time, which has really expanded to our day, was not good. In fact, there was a philosopher back then named Descartes who asked the question, how do I know I exist? And his great conclusion was, I think, therefore I am. Notice, Everything from here up was the answer. The rest didn't matter. In other words, our experience of this world didn't matter. It was thinking. So you see, we began to enshrine things like the intelligence and the spirit world and begin to, in a sense, debase or have a lower image of everything else physical, which means we can do whatever we want to what is physical because it's not all that great and we can control it. And this worldview then developed into what I'm going to call a utilitarian worldview, which we have to this day. And this is really the basis of the tension between the world and the church. The way we look at things, the way the world does. A good analogy might be this. I find this to be helpful. This is a set of railroad tracks, okay? Parallel lines. As far as I know from geometry, parallel lines never meet. So these two worldviews will never meet. They'll always be parallel. On the top rail here, we have what I call the utilitarian worldview. In that worldview, what becomes emphasized is power, control, function, usefulness, practicality, or what is pragmatic. And this is the kind of worldview that began to develop more and more since the advent of the scientific rationalist worldview. And again, it's a kind of a echoing of previous heresies that happened centuries ago. On this rail, we see how the church looks at things. Now, you might remember, if you have watched this series at any point, this word here, sacramental. That's right, that's what we've been talking about all along, those sacramental liturgical glasses. The sacramental worldview does not emphasize any of these, if you notice. I mean, these things are not so bad in themselves, but when they become then the basic worldview, the basic way we interface with life, especially the created order, then we have a problem. And it's contrasted to this worldview. In the sacramental worldview, what becomes important is not who has the power, who's in control, what's functional, but rather sign and symbol. In other words, what reality is being signified or made present? This is why the church uses sacraments and sacramentals, statues and icons and things, incense and candles, and why it uses liturgy. Think of all the art architecture of the church. We've seen a lot of that in this series. Think of those things. They're all very, very sign-oriented. But whenever we talk about a sign in the church, in our worldview, we're talking about something that not only signifies something, but it also makes that thing present, that mystery present. So we have the signs, for instance, of bread and wine in the Eucharist, but those signs are also realities. They make present the very presence of God, of Christ, body, blood, soul, and divinity, through the signs of the bread and the wine. So signs are very real. They're not just superficial symbols. Here's another example. When you drive along the road, we have stop signs, right? They're just pieces of metal, right? With some words on them and some paint. How does that little thin piece of metal with words and paint, an inanimate object, have the power to stop traffic? It makes your car stop, right? It makes you stop. It controls your behavior. Why? It's just a sign. But that sign makes present the whole reality, the whole etiquette of safe driving. It makes you stop so another car can go and you won't have a crash, and vice versa. After you stop, then you can go, another car stops when they see a stop sign. So the stop sign, if you took it out of traffic, you put it on a wall somewhere. It used to be popular in colleges for kids to steal stop signs and put it in their dorms, their frat houses and so on. It used to be a thing years ago. If you saw a sign on somebody's wall in their frat house or their bedroom, you'd probably laugh at it and say, what'd you do, get drunk and steal that? You wouldn't stop, right? But put that sign on the road in the context of traffic, that piece of metal, that sign, which is nothing on the wall, has the power to do something to you, to control you in a good way, because it makes present the reality of driving, safe driving, of how to exist in traffic. So we have a difference between utilitarian, which is just getting the job done, power, control, function, usefulness, and making present some other reality. An invisible reality most of the time, making it visible and present. They do that through sign and sacrament symbol. You might recall we've spoken throughout this series about the theology of the body. We say that our bodies speak a language. They have a theology, which means that what we do with our bodies says something. It makes present a certain reality. We saw that in the one flesh union between husband and wife, that when they come together, their bodies are saying something. They're saying we belong to each other. We're giving ourselves to each other. We're involved in something that is both unitive and procreative. We're coming together and we have the potential of new life all together at the same time. So what we do with our bodies is important because our bodies make present some invisible reality. Well, with that background, we're going to look at another hot button issue today. And this one has maybe a kind of a certain painfulness to it, a certain heartache. And that issue is the issue of conception. We've talked a lot about contraception, or things that militate against life. You know, the same-sex lifestyle, contraception, abortion, and so on. But what about couples who want life? They want to have a child and they can't. They're trying, but nothing is happening. They're not becoming fertile and pregnant. What about them? It's a tremendous heartache for couples. And so they seek ways to have a child. One of those ways is what's called in vitro fertilization. And again, this is where science gets very much into the act. Science can now put a sperm and egg together and create, in a sense, or start life. Only God can create life. It can facilitate life in a petri dish and in a test tube and so on, a laboratory. Now that's an outgrowth of going back to the 16th century. Wow, we can actually do that now. So because we can do it, we think that we should do it. Again, distinctions. Remember you talked about distinctions? Just because we can do something, that doesn't equate to we should do it. So a couple who has the heartache of not having children will sometimes turn to in vitro fertilization. Now that comes very much from that pragmatic utilitarian rail up here. And this is the problem. And this is why the church is against in vitro fertilization. Remember, every time you say the church is against something, it means the church is for something. So I really like to put in the positive. The church is for God, for the dignity of life, for your happiness. And remember, happiness comes from what? Remember the H zone? Honesty. Being honest to the created order. Being honest to the language of our body. We have honesty, we're going to have good things. Dishonesty is going to be some kind of hurt. So a couple says to me sometimes, well, Father, why is the church against this technique of our becoming pregnant, or having a child? Doesn't the church say we're supposed to be open to life? Yes, we are. And you are supposed to be open to life. And we're glad that you are. And we praise the fact that you want life. And that we understand that you yearn for it. And we're sympathetic to your heartache that you can't have it between the two of you. But just because you can't doesn't mean we reach for any means to get that life. Because what happens then is you're approaching life from that utilitarian worldview. And a child now becomes like something you make, a machine. It becomes like a trophy. And what happens there then is that there's not enough regard for the child. You notice in vitro fertilization begins with an I. This is the problem. Anytime we begin with the word I, we're on risky territory. We're kind of on choppy waters there. Not all the time. Sometimes we have to say I. But most of the time when we use I, think how many times we use I in our world today, our vocabulary. The problem with the I is that it's very self-centered. It becomes rather narcissistic. I want a child. And that's all there is to it. I want a child. Therefore, I will get a child however I can. The problem with in vitro fertilization is that it involves what we call oftentimes surrogate motherhood. In other words, there's various ways of it happening, like involve taking the sperm from the man and the egg from a woman, or even someone who's not their spouse, putting them together outside the womb, putting them into the womb. There's different putting into the womb of another woman who carries the child, like a surrogate mother. Well, you can already see there's going to be problems there, because you've got a mother it's from the egg of the mother of one woman, and another woman is carrying that child. So whose child is it really? Who does the child attach to? There's all kinds of difficulties that come up related to the child. Furthermore, the way that technology produces children in vitro is it must produce many of them. It must have many fertilized eggs, and they become embryos. And a lot of times those embryos are discarded. They begin to choose which one they want. And it's almost like shopping. You can see how utilitarian that is, how disrespectful that is of the child. Anytime you have a conception, from that moment of conception, this is for real human being. All the potential they will be in life is there at that moment. We don't talk about being viable or not viable. What does that mean? Who determines that? God already determined that. When they come together, that embryo has a soul, has everything contained in that union that will ever become in need in its growth as a person. So embryos are then discarded and some are kept. Furthermore, some of them are frozen. We have many, many embryos right now that are sitting in freezers. What are we going to do with them? These are human beings. Now, what else happens then is a child who is from, for instance, a donor, like for instance, an egg donor, a sperm donor, if they are created through in vitro fertilization, they can often grow up and not know that they have other siblings. Now, what happens if they meet those other siblings? A boy meets a girl that ends up being his sibling, and they so-called fall in love. Then what? It's not good for them to come together genetically. That's not good, but they're not going to know that. Another thing that happens is, as these children grow up, and again, once the child is here, once a human being is here, we love them. We don't fault the child. But the problem is, and this is something that the I didn't consider, the child grows up oftentimes what's called survivor syndrome, because they know that they were the ones that was chosen, and they had siblings that were disregarded or in a freezer somewhere. Think about that psychologically. We didn't think about that. And even the parents, as well-intended as they are, didn't think about that. Because the problem here, as I mentioned, is that there's not enough thought about the child's rights. That's why I'm calling this the parent's desire and the child's rights. It's not just about the parent's desire. It's also about the rights of the child. Every human being, no matter how young or small, or how old or big, is guaranteed that sense of dignity, of the rights as a human being, as a life that is sacred and worthy of love and a responsible care and response. Also, what happens is kind of the opposite. The child grows up, knows that they were chosen, and they have an attitude of, I was chosen. I am the chosen one. So they end up having this sort of inordinate kind of pride or ego. Yet another thing that happens is these children grow up, they want to know who their father was. For instance, if they're a result of a sperm donor, they don't know who their father is. They long for that. Everybody longs to know who their family is, who their grandparents are, their aunts and uncles and so on. These kids don't know that. And that hurts. They're deprived of that. And furthermore, the donor may have had some kind of genetic thing that the parent should know about, or that child should know about, that they're going to inherit. And there's no way to track that down. There's no way to be responsible for that. So there's all kinds of reasons why this pragmatic utilitarian approach that is based on the I ends up being very harmful, especially to the child. Here's an interesting statistic. In a country, for instance, like Poland, in the year 2014, there were 8,685 couples who submitted themselves for in vitro fertilization. They're going to have kids. 43,000 embryos were made from those couples. 43,000. 2,599, there were 2,599 pregnancies out of those 43,000. And only 214 were birthed, came to be born. So from 43,000 to 214, what happened to all the rest of them? Those were human beings. Where are they? Discarded? Thrown away? Frozen somewhere? To be developed when? Who knows when? I once spoke to a couple and I was asking them about themselves, getting to know them. I said, "Oh, do you have any children?" They said, "No, we couldn't have any children, Father." And they were a very sincere couple, actually a very faithful couple in their own faith, their own religion. And they said, "No, we didn't have any children, Father, but we tried. We tried in vitro fertilization and it just didn't just didn't work." Well, unbeknownst to them, they did have children, probably many children. But where are they? But see, the couple isn't told that. They're not looking at that whole desire for children through these glasses. Rather, they're looking at it strictly, as many people do, through this utilitarianism. In the end, that hurts because it's not honest. No one has a right to have a child at any cost. We bless a couple who desires children. They're right. Yes, the church says be open to life. God wants you to be. We walk with that couple through the pain of their infertility, and there are options, other options. One of those being drop the I out and replace that with gift of self. Let's adopt. Let's be father and mother in a spiritual way. Let's get involved with the young people, children, from scouting to whatever at school, whatever you want to apply yourselves to in a very kind of parental, life-giving way. There's other ways to fulfill that desire in us to be motherly, to be fatherly, to be creative and procreative. There are other ways. They may not be exactly the same as having your own child, but they are other beautiful, magnificent ways. And what else I noticed over the years as a priest? I can't tell you how many couples I know, they could not have children. They tried and tried and tried. They did not choose these utilitarian methods like in vitro fertilization. And they basically decided we'll never have children, but we'll accept God's will and try to be as loving and productive as we can as a couple. And they decided to adopt. And after they adopted, guess what? They had their own child. They got pregnant. I know of couples where they've had many children after that, but it didn't happen. It didn't happen. God did not make them fruitful until they dropped out the I. They opened themselves to God's will, and they made the gift of themselves. They opened themselves to love others. Then God blessed them with their heart's desire, blessed them with multiple children in some cases. It happens all the time. And that's why this view that makes present God's order through the very theology and action of our bodies and our persons, that's the view that will ultimately bring about the most holiness and happiness. It may not always be easy, but we have to trust. Trust God. He will bless us. Great blessings will come if we embrace this worldview rather than that one. Embracing this worldview, that is what we're trying to learn as we go back to school.
Shalom World TV coming to Europe and coming to England. That's fantastic, so that we can get the message of the good news out to people. I think many, many people of all ages, particularly young people, are searching. They're looking to hear a message in their language in a way that they can understand. And good Catholic media can serve that wonderful purpose of getting that news out there and encouraging and challenging people to find out a little bit more of the story of Jesus, which sadly so many people do not know or have forgotten. So it's great to hear. It's good news of Shalom World TV coming to the UK. May the Holy Spirit shower His blessings upon your work and your ministry in serving evangelization and the spreading of the good news of Christ.
Shalom World, God's own channel.